Good morning, everyone. Good to have you here. People are coming in from the early service or dropping off kids. That's all great. We've got lots of seats over here. This table will not bite if anybody's looking for a spot. But welcome to another installment, presentation, session of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. So welcome to everybody in the room. Welcome to folks who are watching on the live stream or a video recording. As always in church, you can't do anything until you've had the announcements. And so let me just quickly go through these. There was no video posted online this week. That was by design because of the way Margaret and I organized things. But a new one will be up by Thursday evening on 1 Samuel, which is the book that Margaret will guide us through next Sunday. So look for that video if you want to do some pre-work. The other thing is we'll be back on Wednesday, or at least I'll be back Wednesday evening in the Meisel room if you want to discuss anything we've talked about today or anything we talked about last week with Joshua and Judges. The only real parameter is it has to be related to the Older Testament. And so that'll be Wednesday evening starting at 6:45 in the Meisel room, and we also are on Zoom if you prefer to Zoom in from somewhere else. Last announcement is November 11th is coming really quickly. What's that, 2 weeks from yesterday? And the Fall Women's Retreat is happening, and the leader is Amy Marga, who some of you might remember from recent. She's more popular than Margaret and me put together.
We did our evaluations last year, and she got higher marks than Matt and I did.
That's right. Yeah, when we did evaluation, it was like, oh, it was a really good class. Matt and Margaret are great. Bring back Amy Marga, was what everybody kept saying. So she's leading the whole, it's a one-day thing here on site, I believe. It's a morning here. I think you can also do it by Zoom. Is that right? So why would you not? Okay, rhetorical question. So what we're going to do today, if this is your first time or you haven't come often, you're in luck. This is a great day to be your first time or to be rejoining us because we're at a bit of a seam, a bit of a threshold between kind of different movements in the Older Testament. This is a slide I had up last week if you were here. The yellow arrow points to Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This is actually my Bible. This is a Christian Bible in terms of the ordering of the books. But you might recall at the very top, we've got 5 books that sometimes are called the Pentateuch. It's not a term you hear a lot, when you're out in the city, but also known as Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law or instruction or teaching. And so we finished those 5 books, and then we're at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And then what's following is the story of kingship to exile. Joshua and Judges talk about the taking of the land or the settling of the land. And then what follows is going to be a story of a variety of kings who come along, and some kings are good, most kings are bad. Not to ruin the ending, but by the end of 2 Kings, the nation will be taken into exile. They'll be overrun by the Babylonians, and things are bleak. And so I just wanted people to get a sense that last week Joshua and Judges are in this seam. They're this transitional point in the larger story. And as we go on, you can see that little purple line down at the bottom. It's pretty much, the books in the Christian Bible are organized pretty much in terms of a narrative. These books are mostly narrative, they're storytelling, and they walk through history or prehistory or whatever we want to call it, the first couple of chapters of Genesis. And so in Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, we're going to get that story of kings. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in a way, retells the story of what we see in 1st and 2nd Kings. Ezra, you might see down there. I know the type is really small. Nehemiah, these are stories of what takes place in and around Jerusalem after the exile. So there's going to be a big jump in time, just so you know. The book of Esther is set during the so-called Persian Empire. We'll set all of this in time and space as we keep going on, so don't feel like there's going to be a test or anything. And then we hit Job, and Job is pretty much a book that stands outside of history. In other words, nobody's quite sure where it's set or where it came from. So we're going to read that, I think, more as like a fable, kind of something that's not necessarily set in a particular culture. And then Psalms, Proverbs, and so on the other side. We'll get to those as time rolls on. But I want to recall from last week this notion that at Joshua and Judges, we've gone from stories of who are these people to then stories of what does it mean to possess this land. And so we had some disturbing stories last week as Joshua and Judges both tried to explain that in their own way. I want to tell a story to kind of illustrate where we're going to go that comes out of, actually two stories that come out of the Torah, out of those first 5 books. And these are ones that Margaret and I both deliberately skipped over, but they have to do with the people who live in Ammon and Moab. And these are places that are essentially modern-day Jordan, if you're trying to figure out where we are. I mean, we all know the map now. You can see Gaza there on the coast off to the west. 2 things happen that kind of tell the story of the people of Ammon, or Ammon, and Moab. And one of those is in Genesis 19:37. And this is where you might have heard of the man Lot. This is Abraham's, is he cousin, uncle? Uncle, I think he's an uncle. Never mind. Margaret gave me this look like, don't do that. No pop quizzes in here. He's a relative of Abraham. And he has 2 daughters, and his daughters are worried that they don't have any men in their lives, and so they get their father drunk, and both are impregnated by him. The Bible is adult literature. And one of the daughters has a son whom she names Moab. And so it's this way that the Bible says, where do the Moabites come from? You know the Moabites. I mean, it's kind of that, roll your eyes, right? Those awful Moabites who had this horrible, shameful origin story. In the book of Numbers, Moses is leading the people. We talk about wandering in the wilderness, and they're wandering around the area of Moab. And the king there will not support them, won't give them food, water, won't give them safe passage. And also the story about a man named Balaam. You might have heard of Balaam's ass. This is a prophet who is sent to prophesy against him, and his donkey essentially forbids this from happening. It's this wild, great Sunday school story. But here are these 2 stories you might just otherwise think, well, those are fun, and skip over them and think they don't really matter. But they come up again in Deuteronomy. This is, again, we're still in Torah. And Deuteronomy has these verses that say this. And again, remember, Deuteronomy is a lot of law, right? A lot of this is how we're going to run things. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, period. Even to the 10th generation, none of their ascendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Why? Because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. And then here's the yet in parentheses. Yet the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam. The Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loved you. Notice all the insider-outsider stuff, right? These horrible people tried to do this to you, but God protected you. Therefore, you shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live. So, if you're in the land, if you're part of the Hebrew peoples, you want nothing to do with the people of Moab or Ammon. Also, we've got chairs here in the front. If anybody wants to use the side door, you can sneak in over there, just so folks in the back know. So that's pretty harsh. There it is in Deuteronomy, right? Basically, forget the Moabites, forget the Ammonites. One of the books that we're skipping over for now, but we're going to come back to in the spring, is the book of Ruth, which I mentioned earlier on. We saw Joshua, Judges, and Ruth are all there together. The book of Ruth starts like this. In the days when the judges ruled, right? Historically, this is the time of the judges, these people who controlled the land just after Joshua and the others took it. When the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. That's crisis. And a certain man of Bethlehem and Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Just to flip back to the map there, you see Bethlehem underlined and you see Moab there underlined. Bethlehem still there today, of course, technically part of the land of promise. So there's a famine in Bethlehem. This is ironic. Bethlehem means house of bread, so there's something already the story's already playing a little wordplay at the very beginning, right? The house of bread experienced a famine and caused a crisis. So this man from Bethlehem takes his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means my God is king in Hebrew, and the name of his wife Naomi, which means sweetness. So already we're getting a sense of how the names are going to matter. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. I'm going to come back to what those names mean in just a second. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. In other words, these are Hebrew folks, right, who live in the land. They live in Bethlehem. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So these are people who were forced to migrate, essentially, right, because of the famine. They choose to go to Moab. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, right, my Lord is king, husband of sweetness, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. Ooh, interesting, right? So they married into the people of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And there's debates about what these 2 names mean. They basically mean something like weakness and sickness, which is kind of funny. Right? There's a little something kind of fable-ish about what's going on here. So these 2 guys couldn't cut it in Moab. So that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So here's another crisis, right? So this woman, Naomi, is an Israelite or a Hebrew. She's now in Moab, and she's got 2 daughters-in-law who are both Moabite. You see the sense of crisis. They've had to flee there because there's no food, right? I mean, this is a crisis situation for a woman with no heirs, right? She's got no men in her life in a very patriarchal society to support her. I'm not going to ruin the book of Ruth for you, but basically what happens is Naomi, the mother, goes back to Bethlehem with Ruth, one of her Moabite daughters-in-law. And as the story basically becomes a story about how will Ruth and Naomi, particularly Naomi, kind of find salvation? How will they find security? And let's just say it has a really happy ending. And the part of the point is here's a Moabite who is welcomed in the land of Israel, in apparent contradiction to that text I read you earlier from Deuteronomy, right? Basically saying, forget the Moabites, they're all terrible people. So here's this counter story, and I bring this story up not to spoil the book of Ruth for you, but to make you more excited about it after we get into the new year, but to point out there's always a counter narrative in the Bible. There's almost always a counter narrative. There's always these stories that push back against the dominant story, that say, yeah, that prohibition against Moab is one thing, but what if an actual real Moabite woman shows up one day and is in need? Like, how are we going to treat her? And she's treated, for the most part, I think, well in that story. So that's just to say, we've seen a lot of law. We've seen a lot of God is our God. God is, we belong to God. We've seen a lot of all these other nations out there are foolish or are inferior in some way, shape, or form. But we're also going to now start seeing different ways in which that story gets undermined from within. You see what I mean? As real life starts to get lived out. So Torah, those first 5 books, tell us the story from creation to the death of Moses, right? And describes the Hebrews waiting to enter into the land of promise. I mentioned this last week. It lays out the vision for the nation, but it doesn't necessarily tell the story of the nation. You see the difference there? It's all by the vision of the nation, I mean the calling of Abraham. You're going to be God's chosen people. You're going to possess this land, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the laws you're going to live by, laws that are supposed to create a just society that honors God's presence in your midst. But they still haven't actually had to do statecraft. They still haven't actually had to form a society. And as we know, as I mentioned last week, land always gets contested. Real life is always more difficult than the vision, right? Real life is never as clean cut as the vision imagines. And that's true, I think, in the Older Testament as well. So Torah, those first 5 books tell the foundational story. They provide a sense of identity or a sense of consciousness. Like, who are we as people claimed and called by this God who hears the cries of the oppressed? Like, what does it mean to be a descendant of Abraham? What does it mean to read about Joseph and Jacob, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph? What does it mean to read about the Exodus? What do all these laws mean? What kind of a society is imagined? Who is this God? People are figuring out who this God is as the story continues. That was the story of Torah. But then the question is, what happens when that theology gets disrupted? What happens when they go into the land and we're not quite sure how violent it was, or when people are actually allowed to live in the land, it gets worse and worse and worse. We talked about Judges last week, of people doing wicked in the sight of God. What happens when somebody like Ruth shows up, a Moabite, comes to Israel seeking shelter? What disrupts our theology, right? What disrupts our foundations is the question I want to sit with for just a moment here. On the one hand, we want to remember when these books were written. We've talked about this a lot, that these books appear to have been written down or collated during the time of the exile. In other words, during a time of military defeat, of cultural defeat, of humiliation, that the people are going back and retelling these stories. But I also want to ask the question, not historically, but even in our own lives. Like, what happens when the foundational story, the basic religious assumptions, start to get undermined in some way, shape, or form? Are there things that ever happen in your life that transform your identity? I was 24 years old, and my father, who was 51, just died of a heart attack for like no apparent reason at all, like no warning, right? I had kind of always assumed you get so many years with your parents, right? That was a time in my life where I had to think, right, maybe life's not fair, right? Maybe you don't get to determine that, right? Well, you know that in your head, but when you have to suddenly live it, right? When you suddenly experience, oh, I guess, right, I guess there's a lot more contingency built into life than I realized. But what happens when that is in a community, in a society as well? Like, what does that look like when it plays itself out? In 1974, at the General Assembly of the United Presbyterian Church, this is one of the denominations that eventually merged into what's now the Presbyterian Church USA, our denomination. But in 1974, at the General Assembly, there was a man named David Sint who held up a sign in the middle of the General Assembly that just read simply, "Is anyone else out there gay?" 1974. I mean, think of a moment where you're going along living your theology, and all of a sudden in the room with you, right, is a person who's basically making a statement, right? I'm not in the mainstream, and there's other people in the room, I'm sure, who also are not in the mainstream. What is the church going to do when something like that happens? He becomes, in many ways, an activist in the church until his early death. What happens in Westminster when we say we're a telling presence in the city? What happens when George Floyd is murdered? How does that affect our sense of, well, who are we in this city? Have we done anything wrong? Have we been short-sighted in some way? Have we missed something? Right? What happens when real life impinges on our neat theology and makes us realize, I think we have to change, right? Or something's going to change. This happens on the national level. Maybe you remember in the Second Iraq War when the photographs of Abu Ghraib came out, right, of the torture that was taking place in those prisons in Iraq, where you suddenly think, I guess we are a country that tortures people. Like, and so what does that mean? How does that mesh with our values? What do we do with our outrage, right? How do we recover our values? What has to be done? Right? All kinds of questions like this where real life becomes messy. So that's why I want to spend just a few minutes with people who are probably sitting near you, either in the back, you can turn to somebody next to you, or at one of the tables, just to think briefly, what disrupts our theology, or what disrupts our foundation? That might be personal in your own life, where something has happened and you've realized, I guess the story isn't that neat and tidy. Maybe it's happened in a church community you've been part of. Maybe it's happened in a neighborhood or a business. Does the question make sense? What happens when the foundational story starts to get undermined? Like, what's that feel like, and then what happens? So you're on your own now. I'll give you about 5 minutes just to chat casually with whomever's next to you, and then we'll keep going. You've got about 1 more minute, so if somebody hasn't had a chance to share, you got 1 minute. All right, let's come back together. Anybody want to share something from the conversation at your table? Maybe something caught your attention that somebody else said, or maybe your table got animated around something, or disagreed about something. We've got a microphone so the folks online can hear and we can hear in the room. Anybody want to just raise a hand if you've got a... Oh, this group's not usually too shy. All right, Ken's going to work his way through there. And then we'll come back.
Our table, one of the things, our table was talking about the various different points along the way in the history that we've all experienced, which have transformed us, and most recently, the conflict in the Middle East, which I think has lifted up for us the Palestinian cause in a way that hasn't been done before. I think that there's been a much more sympathy towards the plight of the Palestinians that I'm seeing, and I think that other people have seen as well. And the challenge for us is to actually to hold the pain and suffering of both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and that seems to be something that the national conversation is having a difficult time doing.
Yeah, it's a good point. We don't have a lot of models about holding pain or sometimes contradictory narratives at the same time, do we? Also here in the front, Ken. Yeah.
Thank you. At our table, we talked about 3 instances where people had experienced tumult in their congregations. We talked about the great happening here in 1999, and 2 other congregations, and in 2 out of the 3 cases, this type of event led to reconciliation and to making a stronger church than it was before. And in 1 instance, that didn't happen. So 3 different instances of congregational disarray.
Disruption, disarray. Maybe we have time for 1 more? Yeah.
Walt and I both shared a similar situation, one in a Lutheran church for him and a Presbyterian church for me, where it was a conflict with the pastor, who turned out not to be who presented themselves to be, and in my case at least, it split the church. They have since recovered. They have strong lay leadership, and they have since recovered, but I had to leave the church, and I don't know what happened to your church, Walt. What happened to your church?
We closed.
They closed. Yeah.
Right.
So what does that do? I mean, it was like a spiritual crisis for me, since I had been on the pastor nominating committee.
Yeah.
So I felt pretty bad about that.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of stories as well. Also, there are some seats in the front if people want to come through the side door or even here. I want to talk a bit about prophets, not P-R-O-F-I-T-S, but P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S, both with an uppercase and a lowercase p, if that makes any sense. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. First, I want to talk about prophets because we've now arrived at the prophets with a big P. And what I mean by that is a new division of the Hebrew Bible. I'll explain more of that in just a second, right? But we're walking into a new segment of the Bible and how the Bible presents itself. And we're also about to encounter prophets with a lowercase p, like actual people who speak for God or who call the nation to a new or to a renewed understanding of who it is. And I say we're about to encounter more of them because some have already showed up. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about them, but Miriam is identified as a prophet in the book of Exodus. Moses as well is identified as a prophet. Their brother Aaron, a prophet. Deborah, we talked briefly about her last week in the book of Judges, as a prophet, and others who aren't named. So there are people who speak for God or who speak to God who have shown up already, and we're about to see a lot more of them. When I say we've arrived with the capital P at this new division in the Hebrew Bible, what do I mean by that? I showed you the Christian Bible ordering earlier. In the Hebrew Bible, the way that our Jewish neighbors organize their books, it's a little bit different. They order their books differently, and what they've got are 3 different divisions in their book. And they often use the word Tanakh to describe this. Tanakh is a made-up word. It's basically the letters TNK, right? It's a, I always forget what these are called. I always want to call them an anachronism, but that's not it. Acronym, thank you so much. An acronym that's got some vowels put in there for TNK in English, and that comes from the 3 divisions. In Hebrew, Torah, like I mentioned before, which means law, prophets, Nevi'im, and then writings, Ketuvim, are those Hebrew words. So you're going to learn some Hebrew today. And at least when we transliterate those into Latin letters, we get TNK. So when they say Tanakh, they mean basically the law, the prophets, and the writings. The Christian Older Testament has the exact same writings as these. In other words, our Older Testament is the same books. We translate from the same Hebrew texts as our Jewish neighbors do, except we have a different order to the books. And sometimes the larger books we like to split up into smaller books. Don't ask me why. We just do it. So we've seen the law, those first 5 books, and now we're about to move into the prophets. So the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. When we get to the prophets, again with a capital P, these Nevi'im, these are the books that our Jewish neighbors read together as a division of the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, this is when they have as a single book. Christians have historically split that into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Same with the book of Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then what Jews call the Book of the 12, which for us we break into 12 different. These are all the ones at the end of the Older Testament who you probably never read, or if somebody ever says like, let's look at the book in Habakkuk, you just panic and run out of the room because you're never going to find it because it's only a couple of pages long, and yeah. I could tell a story here, but it would be too embarrassing and too long. So anyway, in our Christian Bibles, we have the exact same books, but we break them up into 21 separate books. This section called the prophets, you'll see this is where we are. Joshua, Judges, next week, Samuel, the week after that, 2 Samuel, then the books of 1 and 2 Kings. Some of these books are narratives, Joshua and Judges from last week, also the 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 King, are primarily narratives. They're telling the story of the nation and individual prominent people who pop up. People like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and these other 12 smaller prophetic writings are primarily prophetic oracles. In other words, they are primarily the words of the prophet, or where God is sometimes speaking through the prophet. The prophet will sometimes say, "Thus says the Lord," and then issue some kind of a statement. And they're not so much historical. In other words, they're not historical narratives with like a storyteller or a narrator who's walking you through the history. So the form is slightly different. When we get to the Ketuvim, or the writings, these are these books: Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon. Ruth is in the writings, which is interesting, but I think Ruth functions prophetically. And in the Christian New Testament, we break these into 13 smaller books. More on that as we get further along down the road. But this idea of prophets as a distinctive category, this is where I think we can learn a lot from our Jewish neighbors in terms of how they understand this collection, 39 books in all. How does this collection of books work together? And it's because that the books of the prophets, the Ketuvim as they're called in Hebrew, they have a way of challenging the consensus of Torah. In other words, the neat and tidiness of Torah, where it's like, this is your God, that's your land, here are the laws, Go get them, right? And the prophets are enmeshed in the messiness of everyday life. They push back then against that notion of the clean-cut vision that the Torah promises, but they also, I think, want to realize, they want to see the values of Torah brought into being. So a lot of times the prophetic criticism is, you're not living up to who you said you're supposed to be. Or it comes out like, why are we acting this way? Why are we mistreating the poor? The prophets mostly go after the leadership. They mostly go after the kings or priests or other people and say, why have you failed to do what God would have you do? Or prophets are sometimes called into action. Why are we experiencing these calamities, right? So an image there of a bombed church in the Ukraine. Why is this happening to us? The prophets often step in. Not just people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of those people whose names you might recognize, but even the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and the books of Kings are trying to answer these questions, right? Why is it so hard to live up to what God would have for us? And why are these horrible things taking place in our midst? That's a big 30,000-foot view. So in other words, what's going on with the prophets, this is a quote from a book by Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, a Christian Old Testament scholar, who describes the mode of the prophets in the Older Testament in this way. He says, in prophecy, we are dealing with a new truth when the old truth, controlled by human power, has grown irrelevant, weary, and boring. Irrelevant, weary, and boring. Maybe some of your stories that you shared talk about a time when theology became or felt irrelevant or weary or boring or just ill-equipped for the present moment. Right, where all of a sudden you realize we've got a shift here. There's a new voice in the room, or something's just happened in our community that makes us think, how does our theology come to life in this moment in perhaps a new expressive way? Most of the biblical prophets, many of the biblical prophets are poets. In other words, their writing is more poetic than it is what you're getting from me today, right? Lecture. In other words, they try to birth a new imagination into being. We see that in Amos says, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. There's a poetry to Amos's words. And of course, we sometimes talk about Dr. King as a prophet, as kind of a modern day prophet. If you remember the I Have a Dream speech, one of the things that King says in that speech is that the Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, he says these are great documents. They're full of promise, but he says the problem is the check hasn't been cashed. As part of one of the images that he uses in that speech, right? And he says those documents will only live up to their potential when that bank can cash the check for all Americans, so to speak. So he's a prophet in the sense that he's still holding up these values. He still says these core statements of what does it mean to be American, our foundational story is still a liberative story, but he says the problem is it's not working for everybody. And that's in a sense what the biblical prophets are also doing. Right? Torah is still a great story about a great God and a great vision for the nation, but for some reason it's not working the way it was supposed to. Let me just pause here. There might be questions. I'm going a little bit abstract into how I'm talking about how the Older Testament works and what this prophetic voice looks like or sounds like. But I want you to be ready for where we're going next week. And then even when we get to the Advent season, we're going to look at Isaiah, we're going to look at Jeremiah, we're going to have, and then in the new year, we're going to look at Amos, and we're going to look at how, again, some of these voices start to undermine the sense that this is all easy. So are there any comments or questions? Let's make sure we're all on the same, if we're not on the same page, at least in the same book.
I have a question about Walter Brueggemann's statement. The old truth controlled by human power, presumably that's the Torah?
Or kings and priests, mostly, I think, is part of that. The
Okay.
controlled by human power.
Okay, that makes sense.
Sorry to cut you
then.
off. But yeah.
No,
Okay.
that explains it.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll talk more about kings in a minute, but it's largely what happens when the people who have been put in place to guard this foundational vision are failing. Yeah, Betty.
The old truth is the Torah.
I think here for him, the old truth is the Torah, but it's no longer living up to what it was supposed to do, or it needs a fresh manifestation or a fresh expression. Yeah,
And
Betty.
my question is, what we're all thinking probably is, why did this end? Why did prophets, the word of the prophets, come to a conclusion, why aren't we all in our emails getting updates on the new truths?
On the news.
Why was there a cutoff point?
Well, there are still prophets today. Some of them you don't want to listen to. Some we
Yeah.
probably should be listening to. So one of the things that, it's a really good question. Why did it end? In a way, there was kind of an era of the prophets that historically, kind of the way that theological critique happened started to change. But I would say John the Baptist is a prophet in the New Testament. Jesus, I think, is portrayed as a particular kind of prophet in the Newer Testament. People like Anna in the story of the birth of John and Jesus in Luke is named as a prophet. There are other. So there is still a sense of that. I would say that in the church, this idea of prophecy is now perhaps held by the community as a whole. In other words, the church, I think, is called to be a prophetic community, which is really hard because we tend to have a tendency to slip back toward comfort, easy, complacency. But there's something about maybe what a spirit-led church is supposed to look like that still holds up prophecy as a key thing. The last thing I want to say about that, too, is that one of the big concerns in a lot of the prophetic writings is how do you distinguish a true prophet from a false prophet? So, which is why I said there's plenty of prophets today who you don't want to listen to. So watch who emails you is part of that. Like, how do you know when somebody is really speaking on behalf of God or on behalf of the disenfranchised and when somebody is simply self-serving, which is never easy. Mustafa.
Yes, we know that we have a Quran in front of the sanctuary. I just read this morning chapter 5. Is Moses addressing his people? He say, "O my people, enter the holy land which Allah has assigned to you, and do not turn back from fighting in Allah's cause, and thus become losers."
Can you say the last word again? I missed it. Losers.
Losers, yeah.
Yeah.
The main point here is that Allah prescribed the Holy Land for Israel. Same story of Moses and Joshua entering the land,
Yeah.
It's in the Quran, so Muslims now are struggling with that verses.
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up. Right. So you've got in the Quran a statement about God, Allah giving the land to the Jews. So what does that look like? And in a way in which this is what we're...
Chapter 5, verse 21.
Chapter 5, verse 21. Thank you. So this is, and you said people are struggling with that verse today. What happens when the foundational story, again, ends in violence, right? Or ends in injustice? And what does that mean then? That's where the prophets walk in. One more, I don't know where Ken's headed. Maybe to Dwayne. Yeah. It's part of the fun of all the tables. You always kind of wonder, where's the microphone bearer headed?
Is the disruption about a struggle between human and divine or God, or creator and creation, or who? It's who's for me. So who and who. I mean, we're not just talking about a natural event that seems disruptive. We're talking about a disruption in a relationship. What are the partners in the relationship? Is that the story?
I think it's who are the partners. I think the prophets in the Bible speak for God. They claim to be speaking for God as opposed to speaking for themselves, which is part of the boldness. It's why the reaction against them is sometimes so severe. So I think they're trying to give voice to what they perceive as a broken nation, and maybe that's because there's been a military defeat, or maybe because other armies are marshaling against them. Or maybe it's because somebody like Amos just shows up and says, by the way, God says he hates your religious assemblies. Sorry, that God hates your religious assemblies, and God is disgusted by your songs, and therefore let justice roll down. Somebody walked in here, they would not get a great reception, perhaps, depending on how they delivered that message. So I think that Amos is not, quote unquote, speaking for the poor as much as Amos is speaking for God. And that's part of the power of what Amos is trying to do, for example. Does that get at your question, Dwayne? Okay. I want to move on and talk about, as well, prophets with a lowercase p, so actual individual prophets, which is kind of where we're headed with this conversation. You might remember from last week the very last verse of the book of Judges. Anybody remember this? It's a beauty. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did right in their own eyes. So I think the modern image of this is probably some kind of a wrestling, like a pro wrestling match where it's just all out. Everybody's in the ring, just no rules, no referee, no nothing. I think that's what the book of Joshua imagines with that. And so what we'll see next week, and this isn't to take too much of Margaret's story away from her, is the rise of prophets. And because there's a desire to have a king. And so what we're going to get are kings and prophets together, trying to do something with this nation. There's a struggle. Should Israel have a king or not? What does it mean if God is your king? Remember the name of the guy in the book of Ruth? The Lord is king, right? Elimelech. So we're going to have the rise of kings and prophets. Some of the prophets have names you might have heard of. Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, and Elisha are the big names of these people. But what we're going to notice is that these prophets are also paired with kings. So the kings are there to be the quote-unquote political voice and authority of the nation. They're also religious people. And the prophets are always there, sometimes by choice and sometimes not. Right? The prophets keep showing up alongside the kings. Most ancient kings had prophets in one way around them, all the better to control religion, to put it really cynically, right? To have people in your company. And the prophets gave advice. The prophets also sometimes would interpret the events around them. The prophets rarely show up and say, everything's going great, keep up the good work. Right? The prophets tend to show up when something is wrong. The prophets aren't necessarily hostile to the kings or to the notion of kings or to a monarchy, nor are they necessarily hostile to priests or to the law. Some of the prophets are also priests. Isaiah, for example, is a priest as well as a prophet. But they're in this kind of uneasy dialogue around statecraft, right? What are we going to do? Who are our allies going to be? How much can we tax? All these kinds of questions. So they're interested in statecraft and they're interested in religious values. And the prophets are always on hand to tell you when they don't think those things are matching up the way in which they should. One of the circumstances that makes prophets necessary is in Israel, a king could never proclaim himself to be God, as what's happened in some of the other nations. So when your king simply can't claim to be a deity, because that just wouldn't fly in ancient Israelite monotheism, the kings always got to have a way in which the quote-unquote religious voices are kind of coming alongside. So it's this interesting dance that we're going to see with a lot of these kings and prophet relationships. And sometimes kings surround themselves, this is going to shock you, with prophets who agree with everything that they say, who are called quote-unquote court prophets, who are just, we would use the expression yes men, although that's, yes people, probably. So that when we see the roles of the prophet, sometimes they're going to give advice and interpretation. Again, sometimes it's unsolicited. Sometimes it's enacted. This is always fun. Some prophets love displays. Jeremiah wears the same underwear for a year or something like that, and then buries it in the ground. And they're all a little different than you and I. The prophets, and they also make speeches, and they sometimes speak a little bit elliptically. Prophets are forth-tellers more than foretellers. What I mean by that is we often hear the word prophet and we think of remember Gene Dixon or Nostradamus? We think of people who are foretelling the future or something like that, or futurists. Prophets, I think, are less future predictors, and by forth-tellers, I mean these are people who speak out about what's going on. They interpret the current circumstances, right? They interpret the political situation, they interpret the policies of the king. They speak for God in the midst of what's going on. They issue warnings and criticisms and correctives. And again, like I said before, they're in this dance between religious values and the craft of running a state. A couple of things I want to share just in conclusion about these prophets, these individuals. This comes from a great book by a Jewish scholar and a civil rights leader in the 60s, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who says this about the prophets that we find in Scripture. He says, "The prophet is human, yet he employs notes one octave too high for our ears, right? Those notes that, right, the dogs can hear, but humans can't hear, right? They're just a little bit out of our range. He, the prophet, experiences moments that defy our understanding. The prophet is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of the mind. Often the prophet's words begin to burn where conscience ends. One more line. The predominant concern of the prophet was that the destiny of the state, was the destiny of the state and the people. The prophet doesn't regard himself as a spokesperson for the people. Even when the calling for justice, mercy, or kindness for the poor, the prophet does not do so in the capacity of a people's tribune. In other words, he's not like a community organizer. He's not rallying the masses as much as he's a voice for God. The prophet never declares that the poor and the oppressed have commissioned him to speak, or that the people's moral or political plight has occasioned his intervention to set matters right. He speaks at all times in the name of God. This makes the prophets highly controversial in their own settings, and it creates a challenge for us. How do we read the prophets alongside Torah in this relationship? And I think it's really valuable to note, again, there are always these places in the Bible, or almost always these places in the Bible that are undermining the foundations, that are undermining certainty, that are saying, yeah, but have you looked at it this way as well? In other words, there are multiple voices speaking out to us from Scripture. So sometimes we revere the prophets for their insights and their courage under fire. People sometimes have their favorite prophets because these are people who stood up. These are people who spoke for justice. But they're also really important, I think, for us to think about in an ancient society where the king can't claim to be God. Like I said before, the king of Israel could never say, I am your God who led you out of the land of Egypt. What makes prophets necessary? What does their sheer existence tell us about God? In other words, how is God still speaking? Either through the biblical prophets or as we think today, right? What is it that holds us together? What's our foundational story? What are the things that undermine our foundational story? Who are the people we listen to help us put things back together, right? That's the act of prophecy, not necessarily a singular person who shows up in a linen ephod or something like that and speaks poetry out loud, although that would be an interesting Sunday for that to happen. How long have you been wearing that ephod is the first question to ask. Right, but where is the prophetic voice in a community, right? And how does that sometimes come from beyond the center as well? So in a way, when we talk about that prophetic impulse, we're speaking biblically, right? We're talking about the way in which the Bible presents how does God come to be known. A great line from Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares. But just I want to end with two things to think about. One is how and why do we, and by we I mean us, not ancient Israelites, but how and why do we need voices, disruptive voices, alongside our foundational stories? How do we need a prophetic voice who's saying, yeah, but what about? And how do we need as well the foundational story that says, this is who you are, this is who your God is, these are the promises God has made to you. So I would, as our last movement for the day, is just invite you again to talk with folks next to you at your table or in the back, in an adjoining seat. What does this look like to you? If the question's too obscure or too eggheadish, which I sometimes recognize I do, here's a second question that you might choose instead. What's something you've discovered about the Older Testament so far this fall, and why does it matter for you? Some of you have shared things that you've learned that have been formative in changing your perspective. So I'm going to invite us to spend the next 7 minutes talking about those things, and bid adieu to the live streamers in a couple of minutes as well. Make sense? You know your assignment? Go get them. Or go get each other. And I'll call us back together in about 7 minutes.